So, firstly, welcome to Holland, welcome to Amsterdam, and welcome to Casual Connect. I have to start by thanking you for coming and listening to me at this very early hour. The objective of this presentation is to help the next generation of game developers and publishers go on to build successful games that they should, and the industry can, be proud of. Maybe some of you are in this room and you will leave with some takeaways or ideas that will help you achieve just that. In any case, I hope you enjoy the next 20 minutes. So the inspiration for this presentation came about when I read an article last summer. It talked about a study that wants to test whether a computer could generate funnier jokes than humans based on a set of data inputs. The computer was programmed with the format, I like my X like I like my Y and Z, where X, Y, and Z were computer variables. So two jokes that I found that the computer generated that were particularly funny were, I like my coffee like I like my war, cold, and especially for the techies in the room, I like my relationships like I like my source code, open. Not bad for a computer. But what this actual article got me thinking about was what goes into the creation of great games. And I began to become fascinated by the forces of human creativity on the one hand and the power of computer generation on the other. Therefore today what I want to talk about is whether art or science has a greater effect on building successful games. Do the creative Van Goghs amongst us or the scientific Walter Whites have a larger influence? So in order to answer one of the industry's big questions, how to create successful games, we decided to talk to a wide spectrum of talented people in our industry that have helped to build, create, or market some of the most genre-defining, popular, and successful games that have in total generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue worldwide, but also to learn from their mistakes. So it is their personal stories, these conversations and interviews combined with the data that underpin this presentation. I thank each and every interviewee for their time. We've broken down into the following sections: game creation, game design, the influence of data, the game life cycle, and some insights to wrap up. So how do you go about creating a game concept? I mean, you're sitting there in front of a computer, or you've got a blank piece of paper, maybe you're a startup with no funding, maybe you're one of a game studio team within a large company and you have been forced by management to create a hit by the end of 2015. Where do you draw your inspiration from? Well, those that we interviewed found that sometimes they went for existing IP from another vertical. Anthony Brown, the founder of IGP, the guys behind Mech Warrior Online, firmly believes in IP and is constantly on the source for new ones to develop into games. It certainly gives you a leg up, he says, to start with, and gives you that core base of fans that you can build on. And so it proved with the viral growth inherited from the fan base of the BattleTech board game, upon which NWO is based, helping to launch a founders program that generated $5 million of revenue pre-launch. On the other hand, you've got to be careful with working with an existing game. Flare Games, for example, see the potential of working with an existing IP, hence their recently announced deal to work with the next Field Runner game, together with the original developer Subatomic. They also have their concerns, because if you don't live up to the expectations of the existing fans of the game, you'll end up with a lot of one-star reviews, which could kill the new one. Do you maybe use as inspiration an existing game to help create your new one? Mag Interactive, the guys behind Ruzzle, were looking for a concept that they could build very quickly and that required little marketing budget. They saw that word games similar to Scrabble were dominating the market back in 2011. They were super simple to build and immensely popular. And that was the inspiration behind Ruzzle, the original version of a portfolio of branded games that have now been downloaded over 60 million times. However, what they were very careful not to do was just to create another Boggle game for mobile. Or do you just spot a gap in the market? In France, Chuglu Games put their experience in creating great music quizzes on other platforms to good use. They saw quizzes becoming more and more popular. However, a multiplayer music format in iOS did not exist. They then developed an engaging song-guessing format called Trivia Tunes that was also tied into the user's iTunes ID. Having heard snippets of the song during the game, you could then buy the full version on iTunes, with Chuglu taking a share of the revenue generated. Trying to attract a similar audience, but in a different category and vertical, led Wooga to focus on the women 40 and older age group. They saw that they were underserved on the app stores, where they observed a lot of action and strategy games geared towards men, but for the female audience, there were puzzle games, Candy Crush, Jelly Splash, but not much besides that. Hence, they developed Agent Alice as an episodic hidden object game due for release later this month. We then asked, do you have to be passionate about the games you make? Is that important? Whilst it was not the case for everyone, it was certainly for Ben and Alex, who left Kabam to form Zombot Studios. They wanted to push the boundaries with their Project Galaxy game, and not being able to get their giant robots in space concept off the ground whilst at Kabam, Ben and Alex were determined to build a game in that vein when they set up Zombot. So, you now have your game concept created, but how sure are you that you'll have a success on your hands? Yes or no, go or no go? At what point does a game get the go-ahead, get the thumbs up? At Ubisoft, the decision is almost made for the studio teams already. It's almost as if, having decided that an IP wants to work with them and a commercial deal is concluded, that they almost know from experience it's going to be a success, as the value of the IP is so high. However, there seems to be a huge amount of differences between different companies as to how this filtering process is done. Wooga, on the other hand, have a very different method. Last year, we created more than 100 concepts, according to their CEO, Jen Becherman. That's more than 100 concepts on paper, and out of those, 35 prototypes come out of that process, and out of those 35 prototypes came Agent Alice. It's so important also to know when to kill a game or a concept when it's not working. Knowing when to stop can actually be just as important to a company's survival than also deciding to continue and trying to fix it. So now, you've got your idea worked up, and you can start working on building the game of your dreams. But what's involved in the game design process? There are so many factors, frankly, to discuss. Here I have tried to summarize ones that I found important and pertinent. Excess Software realized the value of building a solid community and had it as a design goal when creating their successful online game, Lady Popular. With their female-skewed audience, their community features became paramount and allowed their community managers to build up such a strong relationship with their players that on one occasion, the entire company was actually invited to the Bulgarian wedding of two Lady Popular players who had actually met whilst playing in the game. That's how close they got to their players. But then when designing your game, never forget that you're creating a piece of entertainment. Never lose sight of that fun factor. Even at the largest studios such as Ubisoft, this was never forgotten. Games such as Might and Magic Online, and when also building Settlers Online, the studio had to perform some major restructuring in the initial game testing. They streamlined the first two levels, less game systems were shown at the same time, and they made the gameplay much easier than the original Chinese IP they inherited. The overall effect was to simplify the game, improve the fun factor, and ensure that the gamers that were playing became heroes. MAG Interactive wanted their Ruzzle players, on the other hand, to play on their own terms. So designing the game with asynchronous play was vital to its success. Multiplayer features were obviously important, but they recognized that you cannot force players to play at certain times, and they allowed for greater access points into that game. At Kabam, they found success by operating on more of a kind of factory line operation towards new games. When prototyping new ideas, one core product team always checked to see if their portfolio of new games had the right features in place. They heavily relied on data that had worked for them in previous games, such as Kingdoms of Camelot, helped to inform the game design process and decisions for future games like Godfather. Whilst on the one hand, this seems to be a pattern that is leading to the bigger studios taking less risks, becoming more formulaic, on the other hand, Kingdoms of Camelot has generated over $100 million of revenue. But how many developers actually think about what business model best suits the game they are designing and building, rather than the business model first? Today, if you want to build a hugely successful free-to-play game with a large reach, it's almost a prerequisite that the game itself has to generate enough revenues in order to sustain some form of acquisition budgets. Genres such as strategy and RPG games, on the one hand, tend to work well in free-to-play and can generate the LTVs that are high enough to justify acquisition budgets. On the other hand, games such as puzzler and match 3 games don't tend to monetize as well, so other business models may have to be looked at and other marketing strategies adopted. However, it is absolutely paramount that developers who are able to understand and work backwards from what revenue they need to generate in the first place to keep the game and the company operating profitably, and who therefore know precisely what their conversion KPIs are that the game has to deliver, will be in a far stronger position to design the game that meets their needs. In addition, before considering which business model your game should adopt, always think about the team that you have around you. Switching platform and business model is a learning process. Technics, by way of example, were a developer of boxed racing game products and struggled initially to build and monetize the online free-to-play game Auto Club Revolution when it initially launched in 2011. In that way, also, playing to your team's strengths is also underestimated. At Codemasters, that has been an important feature in their recent game choices. Whilst mobile free-to-play might be the direction the company wants to take its IP into in future, it cannot afford to neglect its console tradition and the talented design teams that it currently have today. And just because a game was a success on one platform, it doesn't mean that the same team and the same company will be able to recreate that success on a different platform with another business model. So now you have your game designed, your business model is chosen, but you need to start verifying if the game is actually performing as it should. So we wanted to find out what influence does data have on game design and how important is it. First of all, you have to establish what data you want to track and what KPIs are important to your game. We clustered the most important KPIs into 4 groups, and then wanted to look at which of them had the greatest influence on the developers we talked to. Retention, it's a quantitative stat. It tells you how many of your players are retained after day 1, day 7, and day 30. That's one group. Engagement is a separate group. It's more of a qualitative stat. It talks about how engaging the content of your game is when those players come back. Stats such as session length are more important here. Number of sessions per day, per month. Your MAU and DAU ratio. It's a benchmark of user stickiness. And then your login sequences that tell the story of how many days in a row active players actually logged in again. Then you've got your monetization KPIs such as RPPU, ARPU, your paying user rates, conversion rates, and ultimately LTV. And lastly, virality, the K factor, and that indicates how many friends your gamers have invited to the game. If it's above a factor of 1, you've done pretty well. Which data set and which KPIs have a greater influence will greatly depend on where you are in your game's life cycle. At these different stages, from launch to growth through to maturity and optimization. However, one major factor that came throughout all of our interviews is that today the influence of marketing on game design and performance is becoming greater and greater. Simply put, we discovered some very upset marketing teams out there. Gone are the days when your free-to-play game could just be released and launched and gather 1 million users or downloads within a month with no marketing effort. So it only makes sense to bring them in, these guys, your marketing guys, earlier into the process. The reality is, you cannot expect gamers just to find you. And marketing teams or strategies have to be integrated early. What's also crucial with game design is also to understand that the foundations for viral growth should be laid at an early stage. Not that you should rely on them, but have them in place. For example, the guys at Ruzzle, Mag Interactive, they integrated a Twitter feature very early on. And whilst their focus was on Europe, they suddenly noticed the doubling of active players in the USA. Their analytics traced it back to a small university town near Mississippi who were active messengers on Twitter. And their unique Ruzzle hashtag meant that people became even more curious when their Twitter followers were challenging them to @Ruzzle. And within 3 weeks, it had virally spread to San Fran, Boston, etc. So if a game is in an early stage, it's just been launched, then definitely retention rates are by far the most important. If day one retention rates were down, the designers of Pocket Starships, spectacle games, knew they had to look into the UI of the game first, and then the tutorial to find the flaw. Their data identified that many players were dropping out early on and in the game, and specifically at a point of building their ship. They found that the tutorial gave the impression the game was actually about grinding, and it wasn't an action game, which is what they actually wanted. When they delayed the crafting of the player's starship until later in the gameplay, the tutorial then became a success, and their retention rate improved by 42%. However, data does two things, in my opinion. It points the way to things that need fixing and opportunities that also need taking. When you're growing your game, they found in Settlers Online, during a particular point at level 4, the data analytics pointed to a large amount of people dropping out. It turned out that there was a bug that did not allow you to finish that quest if you logged out and wanted to log back in straight away. It wasn't actually spotted by the game designer teams, but it was somehow something that data pointed the way towards and that they could then resolve. In Royal Revolt 2, the data scientists saw an opportunity to improve their engagement KPIs. And in December last year, they released an update to the game that now has social features that allow players to form alliances, work towards common goals, and chat with each other. This alliance feature release dramatically increased long-term engagements. As games mature, your monetization KPIs have a greater influence. So for example, in MechWarriors Online, data showed that 20 to 30% of gross revenue was actually being generated in Europe, even though they had no European payment gateways implemented or localization. Many at IGP felt there was a huge opportunity to focus on localizing their content and building their European payment gateways to take advantage of potential greater revenue streams, especially in Germany. Sadly, choices had to be made, and this localization effort was never released, and game revenues suffered because of this. And many felt, unfortunately, that this was actually an opportunity lost. So ultimately, it's also about understanding which interest group to listen to more and which of them should you listen to when it comes to creating successful games. Should it be data? Should it be your gaming community or the development team? A lot of people feel it's a mixture of everything, and certainly at Ubisoft, however, the emphasis is on the community. If they're saying something is wrong, that's where they'll jump in. Warner Brothers feel it's more along the lines of data and the internal feedback that then results as looking at that data that's coming back to you. But also be careful, like Zombot, that they know that data has its importance, but historical data from previous games should not dictate how new games should be designed. For Ruzzle, the best ideas come from developers, and then data is used to test and see what the effect is. The ideas for new game designs are influenced by data, but not driven by them. Ultimately, however, the overall feeling is that data leads the way. inspired by or influenced by your community and your development team. And if you want to make a change to your game, you can just test it, and the data will tell you whether it's worked. So in conclusion, can computers build great games by themselves, like they can generate decent jokes? Or is the power of human creativity alone enough to build the next generation of hit games? Ultimately, my conclusion, art and science need each other, and it's the unique blend of good solid data to start with, how it's interpreted. You've got to ensure that there's early integration of marketing and analytics into the development process, plus a great development team. You have to put your trust in people rather than just in ideas. And lastly, listen to your audience. They're the ones who are going to leave the reviews and will be the ones playing and paying for your game. And without a doubt, it's the best developers are the ones that allow information to flow freely between their data development, community, and marketing teams. One last thing, like with everything in life, you do need a little bit of luck as well. So before finishing, I'd like to thank all of my interviewees once again for their valuable time and insights, and thank you all for listening. I certainly learned a lot in this process, and hope over the last 15-20 minutes you have as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. So we still have a couple of minutes for some questions. So if there are any specific questions you would like to ask Simon, feel free to do that now. Anyone? Well, I do actually have a question,
Please.
Simon.
Hi.
So I would be interested on your thoughts about maybe you can elaborate a little bit. Do you think that actually it needs more science in a free-to-play game than in a pay-to-play game?
Yes, and actually that came out from one specific interview who said actually that alone, from Ubisoft. The data analytics team has far less of an input into their premium games than their free-to-play games, without a doubt. And also that actually at Ubisoft, the design of the games comes more from one person rather than more of a collaborative effort that brings in different disciplines there as well. So yes, I would tend to agree that data is far more important in free-to-play.
Okay. Any other questions? Try to inspire some of you maybe to come up with a question. No? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you.
And okay.